This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we simply cannot thank you enough. This is an episode in an ongoing series co-sponsored by the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History at UCLA, and I am delighted to be joined again by my brother-in-arms, Professor David N. Myers, who holds the Kahn Chair. Professor Myers is Distinguished Professor of Jewish History, as well as the Director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. Hi, David. Welcome back.
Great to be with you, Gilad.
Our guest today is an American writer, poet, critic, and editor at the Wall Street Journal, the author of several books, most recently, and perhaps most famously, On Settler Colonialism, Ideology, Violence and Justice, that was published last year by W. W. Norton. Adam Kirsch, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thanks, I'm very glad to be here.
So the trigger to writing this book was Hamas's attack on October 7th, 2023, and especially the reaction to it in academic and intellectual circles in the West. Can you tell us how exactly the idea to write this book came about?
Well, as you said, right after October 7th, before the Israeli response and the invasion of Gaza, sort of on the night of the attack, as soon as news arrived in the U.S., there was this extraordinary phenomenon where on a lot of elite college campuses and some progressive groups like Democratic Socialists of America and Black Lives Matter, you had people issuing statements saying how much they welcomed the attack, not just approved of it, but spoke about it in very positive terms. That people said they were excited or exhilarated by this attack that killed 1,200 people. And I noticed, you sort of looking at this, that the term settler colonialism came up in a lot of these statements. Israel was described as a settler colonial state, where people said that killing Israeli civilians wasn't really killing civilians because everyone in Israel is a settler and not a civilian. That's a different category. And it seemed to me that this idea of settler colonialism, which I had been familiar with from academic literature and seen in the humanities over the last 15, 20 years, becoming more and more prominent, was now sort of crossing over into public political debate in a way that was really affecting the way people talked about and reacted to real events. So I thought it would be a good moment to write about the idea of settler colonialism, sort of where it comes from, what it means to people, what people mean when they say it, and what are some of the implications for how they think about politics and society in America and also in Israel and the Middle East. So the book, it's a short book, and it was written pretty quickly after October 7th. And about half of the book is about America, the United States, and the other half is about Israel and the Middle East.
So let's go back to the beginning, as it were, Adam. Can you tell us how you understand settler colonialism and how you differentiate it from metropole or extractive colonialism?
So I say in the book that the idea of settler colonialism, or the term, originally arose in the era of decolonization after World War II. And as you say, it was a way of discriminating between different kinds of colonialism, of European rule. So there were some colonies where France or Britain or other European countries administered a very large territorial population through a small number of military officers and government officials. That was the case in India or for the French in Vietnam. And that is one kind of colonialism. And there were other kinds of colonies that were started earlier, such as the United States, Canada, or Australia, where settlers and later immigrants basically displaced or eliminated the entire original population. Originally, that was not called settler colonialism. Settler colonialism in the 50s and 60s and 70s was used to refer to particular kinds of colonies where there was a European settler population living among and sort of governing and dominating a much larger native population. So originally, if you would use the term settler colonialism in the early literature, it would have referred to a place like Algeria or Rhodesia, where you had maybe 10% of the population was European, and they were the settler class. and they were sort of ruling over and oppressing 90% of the native population in Algeria, Arabs and Berbers. So to decolonialize a settler colony like that was a sort of straightforward political and military struggle. And that's what happened both in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and in Algeria, where over a period of time, the colonists were defeated, their political power and sometimes their property and land was taken by the majority. And in Algeria, at least, the colonists left. After Algeria became independent in 1962, almost all of the European population left and went to France. Um, but then in the 1990s, and this is where the sort of focus of the book is, the idea of settler colonialism started to be used in a new way by academics originally in Australia and then later in the United States and Canada to apply to those countries, to talk about those countries as settler colonies or settler colonial societies. And that, I think, is a key conceptual difference and evolution, because in those countries you can't imagine decolonizing in the same way that you could Algeria or Rhodesia. In other words, you can't imagine the 98% of the population that's not indigenous leaving, being evicted or expropriated. So decolonization, if you think about these countries which don't think of themselves as colonial societies at all, if you start to think about them as settler colonial societies, it really changes the way you think about their legitimacy, their sovereignty, and their ultimate future. And that, I think, is the really interesting phenomenon. If you start to think about these countries as settler colonies, what does it do? What are the obligations that you're creating? What are the expectations you're creating politically and also really spiritually and on an individual level too?
So really on that point, I want to ask you, do you find any virtue in the descriptive rather than the prescriptive claims of settler colonialism? So settler colonialism, as you described it in its new iteration, is an argument that a group of settlers come with the purpose not of extracting from, but eliminating the native. And that elimination process can include anything from genocide on one hand to assimilation on the other. And I'm particularly interested in asking about your view of the descriptive power of settler colonialism with respect to Zionism. Because as I see it, Zionism can, I think, very sensibly be regarded as a project of rescue and salvation. And it can be understood as a project of settler colonialism in certain periods. One could argue during the second Aliyah with the ethos of the conquest of labor and then the conquest of land, or in 1948 when it was very clear that both sides favored an entity without the presence of the other, and one side actually had the power to engage in a process of displacement. Or after 1967. It seems to me one can make an argument, and a reasonably compelling argument, that Zionism at certain points in time was a settler colonial project, meaning it was intent on gaining control over the land with a minimum number of members of another national or ethnic group. The flaw, as I would argue, is its monodimensionality. I'm curious to hear what you think about that sort of descriptive power, settler colonialism, in the case of Zionism.
I mean, one of the things that's interesting about it is that, in a sense, when people talk about settler colonialism as a theory, they're not changing or even disputing sort of universally accepted facts. And you can talk about that in American history. Everyone knows that that is the story of American history. It's the story of first British and then other settlers and immigrants coming to North America on the East Coast and gradually fighting wars over the next 3 centuries with Native Americans and taking over the continent, as you said, sometimes through war and massacre, sometimes through expropriation or purchase, and reducing the Native American presence to small enclaves to reservations. So that the idea that that's the history of the United States is not, I think, disputed or disputable by anyone. In fact, it's what everyone learns in America in elementary school about the history of the United States. And similarly, the history of Israel is obviously the history of Jews arriving from other places, originally Europe, later from Arab countries, to a place that was populated by Palestinian Arabs who didn't want them there, didn't want them to come, and sort of asserting their presence and building a community and then later a state in the face of opposition, sometimes through military force. So all of those things are descriptively true. What I talk about in the book is thinking of settler colonialism less as a description of facts than as a theory and an ideology, specifically as an ideology. Because I think that when people use the term settler colonial to describe this history, they're not just talking about what happened, but they're talking about what is the meaning of what happened and what are its implications for the present and for the future. So it goes beyond historical description to prescription. I think that's it's sort of implicit in the term. It's why people use that term. A term that people didn't use to describe the same events, 30 or 50 years ago. And I think that's pretty striking both in the American and the Israeli context. I mean, one of the things that I talk about in the book is that in the past, Palestinian leaders like Yasser Arafat and the PLO really disliked the comparison of Palestinians to Native Americans because they saw it as defeatist. They said, well, look what happened to the Native Americans. We don't want to end up like that. In fact, Arafat once said, we are not red Indians, meaning we don't want to be thought of in that way. For a younger generation, for younger activists, some Palestinian activists, but also even more so American left activists, they embrace that comparison, that identification. The idea that Palestinians are an indigenous people like Native Americans facing settler colonialism from Jews, to them is a very politically powerful framing. It leads to conclusions that they think is favoring their cause. So I think that descriptively, settler colonialism doesn't necessarily bring anything new to the table. And in fact, I would say that most of the people I talk about in the book, most of the people who write about this academically are not historians. They're not trained as historians. Often they don't speak the languages, for example, the relevant languages. People who write about settler colonialism, Americans who write about settler colonialism in Israel and Palestine don't usually read or speak Hebrew or Arabic. They're thinking about it as a theory, as the application of a theory to historical circumstances. And that's, I think, what the interesting and also significant part is.
Yeah, I want to take it now to the prescriptive elements of settler colonialism and ask you about these people who promote that sort of intellectual agenda. Why take them seriously in the first place? I mean, obviously, everything that you say seems very nice on paper, but it's completely outlandish, even completely unrealistic. Why attribute any sort of importance to what they say more than people who say, let's do away with capitalism or other lofty intellectual projects that really have no bearing on reality?
Well, I think that it's a good comparison. I think that you could compare the way people talk about settler colonialism and a sort of avant-garde or vanguard pro-Palestinian activism in the United States. In some ways, it reminds me of left activism in the U.S. in the 60s, where people would praise, Maoist China or Fidel Castro's Cuba. And you could say at the time also the college students or professors who praise these places, that doesn't mean that there's any chance that they're going to turn the United States into a communist country. It's a fringe idea. It's a fringe element. It's not really a serious, important, political threat. And I think that is true in the United States. I think that there is no constituency for thinking of the United States as a settler colony that needs to be decolonized. It's not that's not a massively appealing political idea. In fact, it sort of by definition can't be a mass appeal idea because it favors the interests of, in theory, of the 2 or 3% who are indigenous against the 97 or 98% who are not indigenous. And in that way, this is something I discuss in the book as well. Although it's a progressive idea, and it's people who talk about settler colonialism will always describe themselves as progressive, it's very different from classic progressive ideas like Marxism or other majoritarian movements, because traditionally the idea of a progressive movement is that you are fighting a small number of oppressors or exploiters to benefit the vast majority of the population. And the sort of calculation of that is the opposite. If you think of the United States as a settler colony that should be decolonized, you're really opposing most of the population, not a small minority. But I think that it's different when the idea is applied to Israel. I think that when people who think about settler colonialism or who are used to thinking about settler colonialism in the context of Australia and North America, turn to the Middle East and start thinking about Israel in those terms, then I think it actually is a much more serious political idea with potentially real-world consequences. Because I think that a lot of people, especially young people, have come to see through the lens of settler colonialism, the idea that Israel should not exist is the sort of morally desirable outcome. In other words, I think that if you talk to a lot of young progressives, the idea that there is a Jewish state seems to them inherently unjust. So they're not thinking of a two-state solution, right? The idea that there should be a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. They're saying really the just solution to this conflict is decolonization, which means the demolition, the dismantling of Israel as a Jewish state. And then that could potentially lead either to a binational state or to the disappearance of Jews from what's now Israel, either through emigration or violently. And I think that there's a significant number of young people on the left who would say, without apology and not thinking of it as an extremist or anything that there's anything wrong with it, that is what we should be hoping for. That is the end game that we want. So I think that the fact that that political idea has entered into the mainstream of American politics, not the majority, but it is increasingly a mainstream position. It's something that people say openly or not ashamed to say. That, I think, does have serious long-term implications for American politics, certainly for American Jews, and ultimately could for Israel as well.
I mean, there is a history to that, as you know well, which is to say near total stasis on the diplomatic front, and the fact that Israel has occupied the West Bank and the Palestinian population for close to 60 years. It would seem that progress on the two-state idea has reached the end of its historical journey, at least at the present moment. So I'm just curious, do you think that anyone who calls for a single state between the river and the sea is genocidal in intent and effect?
No, not genocidal in intent or effect, but definitely anti-Zionist. And I think that there are people who don't really know much about Israel and Palestine and the actual geography and demography and history who say that thinking that it would be a sort of a non-problematic outcome. And then there are some people who do know all those things and say it thinking that that they come to the conclusion that that's the best or the only morally, politically acceptable outcome. I think that any sort of realistic, informed understanding of what a binational state, a state of Arabs and Jews living under the same government in Israel, would look like, would have to say that that would be a complete disaster. It would be a bloody civil war with violence on both sides. I mean, just think about who the political leaders are right now of Israel and of Gaza, for example, and then imagine that instead of Israel being a state with a military, you had both of those powers co-governing the same territory with the same. I mean, essentially, a binational state, in a way, is what existed before 1948. And neither side had sovereignty, but you had not, because neither side had sovereignty, the British had sovereignty, you had a sort of quasi-Jewish state, and you had less developed political movements, but also political groups and movements among Palestinian Arabs. And essentially what you had was about 15 years of civil war, leading up to the 1948 war when it became an overt war with international participation. And the creation of Israel put an end to that war. So I think that as someone who is concerned for the future of Israeli Jews or Jews nationally, internationally, that the preservation of Israel as a Jewish state is an absolute priority. I mean, I don't think that a binational state is a viable or desirable option. I understand why people do think so. I understand why people come to that conclusion, but I think that they're wrong.
Right. I guess it depends on which lens one is looking through. Through a Palestinian lens, you could certainly say that the period of time since 1948 has been one of ongoing degradation and disempowerment, and
Absolutely, yes.
calls out for a dramatic change in the status quo. So, I mean, it
Yes,
really depends on which lens one looks through. But I'm curious. Actually, feel free to weigh in on that. But I'm really curious to move to something that's kind of even more fundamental. Do you think there's value in weighing the competing claims of indigeneity? Both peoples lay claim to indigeneity, and that becomes a kind of contest about who was there first or who had more people at the relevant moment. What's your view of the importance of the claim of indigeneity?
Well, I do think that in casting the history of Israel or the United States or other countries in terms of indigeneity, I think that essentially what it does is guarantee the perpetuation of conflict. Certainly in Israel it does. The sort of core idea of indigeneity as a political concept is that every people belongs at a certain place on the earth and nowhere else, where they began. And if you go back, if we could move everyone around to where they were supposed to be, you would have a legitimate and peaceful, just international order. In a way, that is a echo of 19th century nationalism, right? It's the idea that every people should have a state, should have a nation of its own, which it was the context in which Zionism emerged. So Zionism was, in a way, certainly about indigeneity. It was about saying the Jews deserve to return to the land which is their native land. But I think that the history of Zionism and of Israel-Palestine shows that in practice, that is a sort of recipe for eternal conflict because there's no part of the world that isn't indigenous to someone and isn't occupied by someone. So it all, in effect, what it depends on is where you decide to go back in time, how far back you decide to go. Are you deciding to go back to 1880? Are you deciding to go back to 70 AD? Are you deciding back to 1492? You see this in the American context. One of the ways that this comes up is in land acknowledgements. Land acknowledgements are the practice of saying that an institution, often a university, but you also hear it from other kinds of nonprofit institutions or art museums or theater groups, making a formal statement that we are on the land of a particular native people and sort of acknowledging them, usually in some kind of honorary terms, saying they're the custodians of the land or they have dwelt in the land from time immemorial, things like that. Essentially, what that says is these are the people who we know were here when Europeans arrived. It dehistoricizes the actual real history of that place, which goes back in North America up to 10,000 years or more. So the idea that someone was in a place immemorially, or that there's a particular unique spiritual or epistemological connection between a people and a place, which is something that you hear from some Palestinian academics now, I think. I think that's essentially an irrational idea. And I would say the same thing about religious claims, Jewish religious claims to the land of Israel. That's not the ground on which I think of as myself as a Zionist. And in fact, sometimes when I talk about this subject to religious audiences, I get a lot of anger or pushback for saying that. But I don't think that the grounds for being a Zionist or for desiring the continuation of Israel as a Jewish state have to do with the fact that Jews lived there 2,000 years ago, or that it was promised by God on Sinai. I think, or to Abraham. I think that ultimately the only, and this is what I see as a liberal position on this conflict, which is a liberal Zionist position, that the way that conflicts like this come to an end, and they do sometimes come to an end, is when both sides decide that they would rather have peace and relinquish justification, rather than to continue to pursue justification and not have peace. So in the Israeli-Palestinian context, I think that does lead to some kind of two-state solution, which I totally agree with you is not a viable political option now and not in the foreseeable future. I think that there's much worse things that seem much more probable than that. But just thinking about it, what would be a desirable outcome? What would be a morally justified outcome? I think that is probably the outcome that would involve the least conflict, the least death, the least violence. And so that seems to me like the best outcome to the conflict. And one reason why I think that it's important to talk about this idea of settler colonialism and to talk about it in a critical way is that essentially, it's not a recipe for an end to conflict, but for victory in the conflict for one side. People who talk about decolonizing Israel, what they want is for Israel to cease to exist. And so as long as the conflict is posed in those terms, Israeli Jews really have no choice but to fight as they have been fighting to the death, to fight to the ultimate limit, because they see it as an existential fight, a fight for their survival. And so any people would fight for their survival. So I think that framing the conflict as a decolonial conflict or as a fight against settler colonialism actually guarantees worse outcomes for both sides.
I want to go back to the typology that you presented of settler colonialism. As you said, the earlier one, also in the beginning of this conversation, the earlier one that's Algeria and Rhodesia, and the later one as of the 90s, Australia, United States, Canada, and also Israel. And also in the book, I think there's one example that I think is completely absent from it, and that is South Africa. I don't think it's mentioned even once in the book. And I wonder why, and what theorists of settler colonialism think about South Africa in this matrix of the different types of settler colonialism, and also what you think when you're making this a logical journey from the earlier version to perhaps the bigger one, like America and Canada and Australia, and to Israel. Where does South Africa feature in all this?
It's true. I don't talk about South Africa in the book because it is an important part of the conversation because it's a much more complicated reference point, basically, and would involve a different kind of discussion. If you think about how apartheid came to an end in South Africa, I don't think it was in terms of decolonization. It wasn't framed in terms of decolonization. It was framed in terms of an end to apartheid or civil equality, civil rights. And I think that that's a different sort of conceptual framework. To say that you're fighting for civil rights, for civil equality, is different from saying you're fighting to decolonize, because and again, this might be a good example that the way that that conflict came to an end was that both sides sort of agreed on that to accept that idea rather than the elimination of one or the other. I mean, I think that that Israel and its history are significantly different from the history of South Africa along various dimensions. I know that there are people who would say that the ideal future for Israel would be something like South Africa. It would be the sort of end to any legal distinction between Jews and Arabs or any identification of Israel as a Jewish state. It's probably not a possible outcome, and I don't necessarily think it's a desirable outcome. I think that it is important for the Jewish people, I would say, that there be a Jewish state, a state in which Jews are the majority. That was sort of the original Jabotinsky-ite definition of what Zionism's goal was. It was a state with a Jewish majority. Jabotinsky in the 1920s wrote, we don't want to evict Arabs. We can't evict, and I promise that we never will evict Arabs. We don't need to be the only people in the Jewish state, but we do need it to have a Jewish majority. And I think that because of the unique situation of Jews as a people around the world, a persecuted people, susceptible to violence, susceptible to discrimination, that it's very important that there be a state in which Jews control borders, immigration, all the things associated with the right of return. And I don't think that that could exist in a binational state.
Yeah, but within the theory of settler colonialism, does, I don't know, Nelson Mandela, for example, is he regarded by proponents of settler colonialism as the traitor to the cause because he didn't basically effect decolonization the way they see it?
I don't think he's regarded as a traitor, but I don't think he's thought of as a figure of decolonization. In other words, one of the reasons why South Africa isn't as big of a focus in the theory of settler colonialism as one might expect is that it has not followed a pattern of decolonization. So there are ways to think about sort of truth and reconciliation as a form of decolonization. And there are people who would say that that's what the United States should do, for example. When people talk about what would decolonization mean in the United States, there are some people who say it would mean actually sort of bringing American sovereignty to an end or maybe ceding part of America's territory as a native homeland. But there are also people who say it would mean rethinking sovereignty, rethinking the idea of the nation, saying that we shouldn't be loyal to a nation but to some other kind of community. And that could look more like post-apartheid South Africa. But people who really think in terms of decolonization don't see that as a desirable outcome. They want something more dramatic, more complete.
Right. So I want to follow up on that, just sort of restate what I'm hearing, which is a primary concern, maybe the primary concern for you is the well-being and safety of Jews in the land. I think there's a way to read settler colonialism as not merely committed to the erasure or eradication or displacement of Jews, but as a commitment to the principle of equality. And here I want to sort of take up your treatment of a figure who's become prominent anew of late, and that's Mahmoud Mamdani, not so much because of his work, but because of his son, the Democratic mayoral candidate for New York City, Zohran Mamdani. And here I'm thinking of his book, Neither Settler Nor Native, which talk about, I think we may have a disagreement about how he sees Zionism in relation to Nazism, but It's not that point I want to take up. It's the very idea of neither settler nor native. What I find winning in that claim is it isn't about reinscribing a new victor, a new powerful person in the hierarchy. It isn't just subverting the current hierarchy of power by making Palestinians dominant over Zionists. It says settlers and natives should be equal, right? So, in theoretical terms, that commitment to equality seems unassailable. And if one adds to one's own lens concerned with the well-being of Jews, a lens that is sort of more capacious and understands or seeks the well-being of all people between the river and the sea, it doesn't seem so violative of a meaningful notion of justice, or at least to me. So I've been sort of anxious to hear your take on that.
It's been a long time since long time. It's been 18 months or so since I read the Mamdani book, so I don't want to try to characterize his arguments too closely. I think the thing that I quote that you're talking about in relationship to Nazism is that he says that Zionism was the completion of the Nazi project of eliminating Jews from Europe, which I think is an offensive and historically ridiculous thing to say. But and also Zoran Mamdani, I would leave out of the conversation entirely because he's a different person and not responsible for
Just
what his
calling
father writes.
attention to the
Yeah,
notoriety
it is in fact.
of the
It is in
father.
fact. Yes, exactly. I think that there are people who favor what they would call de-Zionization, right? The idea that neither settler nor native, that there should be no distinction between Jews and Arabs legally or politically. This is sort of moving a little bit away from the idea that the academic ideas of settler colonialism. I think that that is a sort of moderate position. I think that if you were to look at this academic literature, you would find a lot more people who say that who are motivated by real anger and desire to eliminate the Jewish state, to characterize it as historical evil, to get rid of Jews, to make Jews sort of decolonized by leaving. I think there are a lot of people that is probably a more widespread idea in this field than the idea of equality for Jews and Arabs. I think that this is a question that people have been agitating for a long time. It's one of the basic divisions between Zionism and anti-Zionism or non-Zionism in Jewish politics. It has been since before 1948. Hannah Arendt made similar arguments that Zionism sort of reinscribes nationalism. Jews had suffered from nationalism, and now they're practicing nationalism, and that the ideal would be a world without nations. I think you could make an argument for that in the same way that Isaiah made an argument for beating swords into plowshares. But I think that living in the actual world, with the sort of world that we do live in, with the people and the forces that we do live in, it strikes me as sort of politically insane to say a people that is sort of rejected and hated by all of its neighbors and who have just recently been the victim of this sort of massacre by Hamas should say, the real solution to this problem is that we have too much power and too much military might, and we should give it up, and we should all sort of live together under one roof. I think that is just a profound misunderstanding of the way human beings behave and would behave and will behave. So I think that part of Zionism historically is about political realism. It's about understanding how politics actually work and what is necessary to sort of achieve the goal of Jewish well-being. And I understand the sort of intellectual argument against it, but I think that the political argument against it is wrong.
As you said, the book was written pretty quickly after the 7th of October, so that is 18 months ago. And one of the claims made by the so-called pro-Hamas crowd, even before, as you said, before the invasion of Gaza by Israel even started, was things like stop the genocide of Palestinians, etc. Now, 18 months on, after a tremendous death toll in Gaza and complete destruction of large parts of the Strip, the argument of genocide is still contested, but perhaps less than it was on the 8th of October 2023. And I would like to ask you on that, and perhaps in other respects of your argument, whether the time that has passed since the writing of this book until today, when the war is still ongoing, made you reflect and perhaps reconsider some of the things that you wrote.
In writing the book and also writing other things since the book, I've thought a lot about how the idea of genocide is deployed, how the term genocide is deployed in this context, in this debate. there's nothing gratifying about saying war crimes, yes, but not genocide, or massacre of civilians, yes, but not genocide. That's not a sort of likable or appealing distinction. I think that it is an important conceptual distinction that has to be made, because the idea that Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians far predates October 2023. I think that there's a sort of basic assumption or idea in a lot of this milieu, in this discourse, that the existence of Israel is genocidal. That as long as there is a Jewish state where there shouldn't be a Jewish state, where there's supposed to be an Arab state, that is sort of definitionally genocidal. And one reason why that happens is that in this discourse, the term genocide is redefined in ways that are not intuitive, and that people who aren't familiar with it don't necessarily understand. So depending on the writer, genocide is broadened to mean structural or cultural genocide, which means basically anything inimical to the interests of a group, anything that prevents a group from sort of living in its land, or from continuing its culture, or from living in peace and security, can be construed as genocidal in one way or another. And I give several examples of that in the book. So if genocide is defined as the desire to destroy a people, the attempt to destroy a people, you could say that there's never been a successful genocide, right? Even the Holocaust was not a successful genocide, because the Jewish people still existed afterwards. So if murdering 6 million people was an attempted genocide, it wasn't a completed genocide. But I think that what most people think of when they think of the word genocide is the the attempt to destroy an entire population, the murder of millions and millions of people, the attempt to wipe out a group of people. That's the sort of Raphael Lemkin idea, that what distinguishes genocide as a crime is to remove one nation from the world scene, to remove one sort of possibility of human being, of human community, and have it cease to exist. I think that is clearly not what the history of Israel and Palestine shows. It's not what the conflict since October 7th shows at all. You could say that the conflict since October 7th shows a lot of very bad things on the part of the Israeli government or armed forces, including massacres and war crimes and collective punishment. I think there's a lot that we will find out, hopefully, when the conflict is over, that we don't know now about what is actually happening there. But I don't think that genocide is the right way to describe that or to think about it. Partly because I think that genocide is wielded against Israel, and has been, again, since long before this current conflict, as a delegitimizing term. It's to say, you think that Israel was born as a response to genocide, or as a compensation for genocide, which is how a lot of people think about it. But in fact, the Israelis are committing a genocide, and therefore their right to exist as a country has been annulled. It's been revoked. So I think that it is important to make that distinction. It is important to say that what's happening in Gaza is not a genocide. What's happened in the West Bank and Gaza over the last 60 years is not a genocide. It might be a lot of other bad things, but it is not that.
Yeah, I guess I have a different take, which is one should distinguish these terms that we're using, settler colonialism and genocide, from the coarsest formulation of some ideologically committed people. For example, we began by talking about the things that I think are descriptively true about settler colonialism that you agreed with. And similarly, I think one can't avoid the question of genocide today, even though I readily acknowledge that there are many who have been laying claim to Israel's genocide for decades. But I think we've now reached a different point, and it's a very serious question. I think one can't simply dismiss it because it has been used in such a sort of hackneyed or a knee-jerk way. I think it's necessary to take it up seriously, and with attention to what the convention says, the intent to destroy in whole or in part an ethnic, religious, national group. But I want to maybe, as we move towards wrapping up, ask you about what historical reparation might look like. Let's say we can agree on what happened in Gaza as something very terrible, or let's say we can agree that what happened in 1948 was something that inflicted a grievous wound on the Palestinian people. What do you think is an appropriate mode of historical reparation, if any? You suggested we needn't. There's no virtue in litigating the justifications for this or that claim to indigeneity. So what does historical reparation have any play here in conflict resolution?
It's a very good question, and I don't know if I have a good answer for it. Ultimately, I mean, often in talking about this book and the subject, it comes around to the question of, well, what should happen next? What is a solution? And I think if there was a solution that everyone could agree on, it would have been implemented a long time ago. The reason why the conflict continues is that there is no solution that everyone can agree on. And so if I give my opinion about what a solution should be, I don't know how much, practical value it have. I could identify what it seems to me the main obstacles to a solution or to some kind of reparation are, which is that Israeli Jews feel that any cession of territory or power will be used against them, that it will create a base for attacks against them, and that's what happened in Gaza, and that if it were to happen in the West Bank, it would be even more dangerous because it's closer to Israeli population centers. So while I would say a two-state solution makes sense, but I also understand why Israel, the majority of Israelis, are very opposed to it and don't see it as viable or secure future. That being said, what does a practicable solution look like? I don't think I have a good answer. I don't think in writing this book I had an answer in mind. I think that maybe starting from the other end, not where things will end up or should end up, but where they should begin, is that you have to begin with an acknowledgement of historical truth. You have to begin with an acknowledgement of the truth, as you say, of what really happened in 1948, what's really happening now, what really happened in America after British settlement. That has to be sort of recognized and honored by everyone and not distorted in order to serve current political agendas. But also, there has to be a recognition that the present and the past can't always be brought together in the way that we might like. In other words, what I say in the book at the end is this: as I talk about this concept of despair in halacha, despair in the halachic sense, meaning when you lose or are robbed of something and you despair of getting it back, then legally it ceases to be your property, and that means that you are entitled to compensation, but you're not entitled to the return of the actual item. And I talk about why the rabbis institute that idea and how it is sort of for the benefit of all, even though it involves injustice. And so I think that in a way, the sort of way forward in conflicts like this, and you could say the same thing about Northern Ireland or South Africa, is that it involves despair of the past in a certain way. It involves saying, we're not fighting about the past, we're fighting about or talking about the future. How can we make a better future for everyone who's involved in this conflict? And I think that would be my criterion of judgment in thinking about what should happen.
All right, Adam Kirsch, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And many thanks to you, David, as well as to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request, because most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app and would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Good, bad, ugly, up to you. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has probably more than 1,000 interviews by now. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and now also on Blue Sky. And most important, join us again next time for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.